Hi everyone, I'm Brett Drummond. I'm one of the co-founders of MStranslate, and as you can tell from my snazzy backdrop here, I'm reporting to you again virtually from Phoenix, Arizona, which was meant to be the site of ACTRIMS 2021, which we're now all attending as a virtual conference. We've just finished day 2 of all of the presentations, and so I wanted to give you a summary of some of the highlights of the talks today. So let's get straight into it. So one of the first talks that we had today was from Jorge Correa, who's from the Raul Correa Institute for Neurological Research. And he did a talk where he was looking into trying to find out reasons for the link that exists between obesity and multiple sclerosis. And so looking into that, the first thing that they saw was they found this molecule called leptin. And this molecule called leptin they found was increased when there was increased weight. So in both healthy individuals and people living with multiple sclerosis, they found that as they went from a normal BMI range to overweight, the leptin increased in both the healthy controls and the people living with MS. And then when they went from there to obese, that level of leptin then increased again in both groups of people. So that's important to know that this was a molecule that was linked to obesity and not just a byproduct of the multiple sclerosis, and that it increased as we got higher in terms of the amount of weight that was there. And so they wanted to investigate whether or not this molecule, leptin, was having any impact in multiple sclerosis and could be used to explain those links that they see. And they saw a number of really interesting things. Firstly, they found that leptin was pro-inflammatory. It could promote inflammation and increase inflammation. They also found that in the presence of leptin, there was no deletion of autoreactive immune cells. So one of the processes that we have to protect us against autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis is that when there are cells that react against self, so like in multiple sclerosis where we have cells that react against proteins of the myelin sheath, when this occurs, these cells can be deleted so that they no longer exist and they can't attack the body. And what they found is that leptin seems to prevent this from happening. As well as this, they also found that leptin inhibits regulatory T cells, so cells that are involved in keeping the immune system in check. So if we really simplify this, we can think about the immune system as having the good guys in terms of multiple sclerosis, and they're the regulatory cells, and the bad guys, which are the cells that are attacking and creating the damage in multiple sclerosis. And leptin very much seems to be playing the side of the bad guys and helping out that team, and at the same time inhibiting the good guys from being able to do their job. So this is a really interesting study that seems to provide actual insights and mechanisms as to why we might see some of those links between obesity and multiple sclerosis. So it'll be interesting to see how that is then pursued to be able to figure out ways of being able to better manage and perhaps treat multiple sclerosis. And so actually one of the things that I talked about with Jorge during the question and answer session was I raised the topic of metformin, because we have seen in previous studies that metformin can also lower leptin levels in the blood. And we know from other things that metformin is currently being pursued as a potential treatment for multiple sclerosis, and whether or not that was part of the reason why we do see benefits with treatment with metformin in animal models of multiple sclerosis. So very interesting. We'll see how this all proceeds, and we'll continue to follow that up. The other 2 presentations that I really want to talk to you about are obviously very topical at the moment, and they were both to do with the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts that it has on people living with multiple sclerosis. So the first talk was from Amber Salter, who's from Washington University in St. Louis, and she was looking at the outcomes of a COVID-19 infection for people living with multiple sclerosis through the COVMS registry that they've established in the US. And so one of the things that they found is that in terms of risk factors for having a bad outcome upon infection with COVID-19 for people living with MS, is that older age, seem to worsen the outcomes. Now, that's also something that we see in the rest of the population, is that older people tend to have a worse outcome from these infections. Also, decreased ambulation was associated with worse outcomes. So people who had relatively normal mobility, they had better outcomes than, say, someone who was wheelchair bound. Those were the two main factors that in their registry saw impacted on the outcomes of a COVID-19 infection. She also touched upon something that we talked about during the MS Virtual 2020 conference, which is this association that's been seen in a few of these different studies implicating some of the Bcell therapies with having a worse outcome. And again, she suggested that there was a slight association with that in their data, that being on one of those therapies, such as rituximab or ocrelizumab, both slightly increased the risk of being hospitalized if you had an infection with COVID-19. That's data that's still being looked into, so we'll keep following that up. The other talk in this space was from Professor Amit Bar from the University of Pennsylvania, and he was talking more about COVID-19 vaccinations for people living with multiple sclerosis. And so he covered three main questions. The first two were covered very quickly, and they were, is the vaccine safe for people living with multiple sclerosis? And to that he said, yes, the vaccine was generally safe for people living with MS. Is it safe for people on DMTs? And again, he said yes to that. The important point that he stressed was that this is not a live vaccine. This is an inactive, a non-live, inactive vaccine. And so generally safe for people living with multiple sclerosis. But mostly what he wanted to talk about was the effectiveness of the vaccine, or the potential effectiveness of the vaccine, if on different disease-modifying therapies. And so generally the take-home message from this was that the vaccine will be effective for people who are taking disease-modifying therapies. The one thing that he did touch on again is that those CD20 therapies, or the Bcell therapies, so things like rituximab or ocrelizumab or Ocrevus, may slightly impact on the levels of benefits that are seen from the vaccine. And so this is going back to the evidence for this comes from previous studies where they've looked at these therapies with different vaccines. So not with the COVID-19 vaccine, we don't have any data on that yet, but where they looked at the response generated to other vaccines, and they saw that that response was slightly lower on these therapies. But what's really important is that even though the response generated was lower on those therapies, the response that they did receive was still far beyond the threshold needed to generate protection from what the vaccine was trying to protect them against. So while they're suggesting that there may be a slightly lower immune response generated if on one of these therapies, they still do expect that it will be enough to generate protection against COVID-19. The other point that he talked about was just that there may be some timing specifics that are needed depending on the type of therapy that people are on. And this is all based, or this is all covered in the guidelines that have been prepared as part of the National MS Society's guidelines for people living with MS around the COVID-19 vaccine that Amit was part of generating, and those can all be found via the links on the MStranslate website. So as always, as I said yesterday, also having lots of conversations with these researchers during the conference, and they've been really positive. So I am really hopeful that we will be able to bring you some more interviews directly with the researchers involved in these studies as well. So if there are any topics that you hear about that you do find particularly interesting, make sure you do comment below the video and let me know that, so that I can chase up those researchers as well and see if we can get them to participate in an interview. Otherwise, that's it for the day 2 summary. We've got day 3 tomorrow night. And once again, I'll be providing the highlights for that. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you've enjoyed the video. As always, if you do have questions, please do just post them below the video, and I'll make sure that I respond to them all as quickly as I can. Thanks, everyone.